The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on the agenda, John Michael McGrath and I with our weekly onpoli podcast. Stephen Lecce would like to be the leader of the Ontario PC Party at some point.
The worst kept secret in Ontario
well,
politics.
There you go. Okay, you're putting it more bluntly than me, but not inaccurately. And it's a fact that education minister is often seen as a stepping stone to leader of the party. Okay, partner, no chit-chat off the top this week. We got serious business we got to get to right away. Yes, because big significant developments at Queen's Park yesterday afternoon. Premier Doug Ford made some major changes to his cabinet. So let's start with who's gone where. And let's stipulate right here off the top that premiers almost never explain why they make the moves that they make. But that will not stop us from engaging in some, I think, reasonable speculation behind the moves. And let's start with the big trade. Stephen Lecce was the education minister. Now he is the energy minister. Todd Smith was the energy minister. Now he is the education minister. Yes. What do you think?
Well, let's start by saying that Lecce was education minister for 5 years, and they weren't easy 5 years.
No kidding.
That included COVID and shutdowns, and then, of course, negotiations with teachers' unions. All of those decisions, including a blow up last year that we're actually going to talk about later in the podcast. All of those things were difficult, tumultuous times, and anybody could be excused for maybe wanting to tap out and take a bit of a less controversial file.
Did you just say tap out?
Yes.
That's a wrestling term, you know.
I did used to watch professional wrestling
wow.
when I was a young lad.
Okay, so you don't watch hockey, but you watch wrestling. Okay.
I did. I'm not up to date. Let me put it that way. And, Todd Smith, on the other hand, is, I think, widely perceived to have done a reasonably good job as energy minister for the last little bit. He likes the file. He's a bit of an energy nerd as these things go. He was an energy critic for the Tories when they were in opposition, so he knows the file very well. But he's also, I would say, a more genial politician. And if you need somebody who's going to just keep things quiet and keep things calm and not anger too many people, I think Todd Smith is the kind of guy that you tap in.
It's funny that you say keep things quiet because he's a former radio guy.
Yes.
Prince Edward County is where his home base is. He was in radio in Belleville, and he is the one guy in this legislature who does not need a microphone to be heard. Yes. He has a big, booming radio voice. So Todd Smith will enjoy this. He missed his own swearing in, He was overseas doing business, doing energy business for the province of Ontario in Europe when this happened. So he missed his own swearing in.
Yeah, no, he's done a lot of traveling because there's a lot of interesting stuff happening, particularly in the nuclear sector in Ontario. And one of the jobs of an Ontario energy minister is to go travel the world and say, hey, we make good nuclear reactors here.
Yeah. Now, let's go back to Stephen Lecce for a second, because those of us who keep an eye on what's going on down there know that Stephen Lecce has been trying to get out of the education portfolio for a very long time. It's not that he doesn't like kids, but it is the fact that he has gone to the Premier in the past and said, Premier, I've been here 3 years. Premier, I've been here 4 years. Premier, I've been here 5 years. He's not the longest serving education minister, but he's one of the longest serving. I've been here 5 years. It would really be nice to get another portfolio. And the Premier would say to him all the time, Stephen, you're doing a good job. I need you there because we've got these heavy negotiations with teacher unions coming up, and you're the steady hand on the tiller I need to fix all this. And so as a result, Mr. Lecce did not get moved until just now. It's also fair to say, I don't think this requires too much getting out over my skis, that Stephen Lecce would like to be the leader of the Ontario PC Party at some point.
The worst kept secret in Ontario politics.
Well, there you go. Okay, you're putting it more bluntly than me, but not inaccurately. And it's a fact that education minister is often seen as a stepping stone to leader of the party. Yeah. Kathleen Wynne, Bill Davis, John Robarts being three prime examples. And having said that, you do want to be able to show a range of skills and knowledge if you're going to be the leader of the party, which is why ultimately Stephen Lecce went to the Premier and said, now, how about now? Is now a good time, Premier? And it's finally happened.
Right. And to that point, I mean, energy is a file. I mean, the Tories it helped get them elected in 2018. Their criticism of the liberal energy policies of the time. Energy is a really salient issue for this party, and now with the wave of EV investments and changing technologies, the broadly defined the energy transition that we talk a lot about as we move away from fossil fuels to a certain extent and electrify more things like home heating. This is going to be a very meaty issue for any minister to really dig in on. It is also the case that it gives Stephen Lecce a really primary role in being an attack dog for this government over the next year as they try to lay into the Liberal Party and Bonnie Crombie over allegations that they will be, aficionados of the federal carbon tax. We can see them sort of laying out the groundwork for the next year of attacks here.
They changed his title, though, right? He's not just the Minister of Energy. He's the Minister of Energy and Electrification. What do you read into that?
Well, I think the government has... let's say belatedly. I mean, you can remember that, like in the first year of the Ford government, they were not actually terribly enthused about electrifying transportation and other things, and they have, as I say, belatedly come around to this because, frankly, like just objectively, there's a lot of things that are in Ontario's interests, quite aside from environmental concerns. Making EVs here, frankly, spending less money on imported oil and natural gas, right? Keeping that money in Ontario, buying electricity made in Ontario. These are things that are in Ontario's interests, and I think you can see them both embracing that shift, and also, frankly, it's probably smart politics.
There are a few other noteworthy things we should say about this cabinet, starting with this. There are 36 members in this cabinet. That's the biggest ever. The biggest cabinet. Almost half the members of the PC caucus are in cabinet. David Moskrop, who is a pretty spicy columnist, writes some stuff for us every now and then, says in his TVO.org column for today, there is a minister for red tape reduction, but there is not a minister for irony. Which is a great line. Nobody from the last cabinet was dropped. Often when you do shuffles, sometimes people get dumped as you want to bring new people in. The premier, I guess, looked into his heart and said, I can't dump anybody, so if I want to get some new people in, I'm just going to have to make it bigger. And there is a name from the past who was in cabinet and then wasn't in cabinet and is now back in cabinet. And that is
Steve Clark, formerly the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing. He was not fired, but he did resign from cabinet last fall during a particularly hot moment in the Greenbelt scandal. It has gone quiet for now. It may get noisy again in the future. Clearly, both Clark and Ford have done the calculus that bringing him back into the inner circle of provincial politics is not going to do too much harm to the Progressive Conservative brand, despite the fact that, as we say, Clark was associated with, I think, what we could fairly call the most damaging for this government to date. That said, I mean, there are reasons to do this from Ford's perspective. I think one is that, when he was in cabinet, Clark was very often called on to be a bit of a firefighter, right? He could come in when something had gone wrong. And, sometimes he was very good at sorting things out, particularly, of course, in his specialty of the municipal file. So having him in the government House Leader role, I think he had also served as an opposition House Leader back before the 2018 election. Having him serve as the government House Leader role, where his job is to, ensure the orderly procedures, a process of the government's agenda through the House, that makes some sense to me.
And we should also point out, you obviously don't have to run a department to be in cabinet. Steve Clark does not have any ministerial responsibilities, but as government House Leader, he is in the cabinet. And as somebody once told me, there are no bad seats at the cabinet table. If you're in that room at that table, it's where you want to be.
Yes, the room where it happens.
The room where it happens, exactly right. Let me ask you about this. It is not unusual, of course, for the House to break in June and then take a bit of a summer off and then come back usually in September to face your opponents again, get some bills introduced. They are not coming back until the 21st of October, which is later than normal. What do we make of that?
Yeah, so the government used to, I mean, and now going back before my time at Queen's Park, the government used to often not come back until either very late in September or sometimes early October, back when the Liberal government made a bunch of changes to how the legislature sat. They dropped Friday sittings because they wanted to be more sort of family friendly, dropped evening sittings, but they then lengthened the calendar. So in one sense, you could argue this is a bit of a return to a tradition, but I'm not sure how charitable we need to be.
Well, the opposition's not being charitable about this. They have a very definite interpretation of why
absolutely.
this is happening.
They're quite livid. And from the opposition's perspective, they have every right to be, right? They are going to have less time between now and the next election to hold the government to account. For the ministers, particularly for the new ministers who have just been assigned new roles, they can feel quite fortunate. They are going to go 19 weeks, I think, by our count. They're going to have that time to learn their portfolios, memorize the big binders that they've just been handed from the public service about, what is Ontario's education sector even? But yeah, it is a really long break. I mean, it's not just that they're coming back later. They're also they adjourned the House earlier than expected, so it's going to be a very long break. And I suspect you can never tell what is going to land in the public consciousness. This feels like one where they might take some heat from voters on it. It's just you and I understand that MPPs don't disappear over the summer. They do constituency work, but I think the public is going to ask, a 19-week summer break? Are you kidding me?
Well, and let's also remember, the government very much controls the agenda of provincial politics in this province. And the one aspect of the agenda that the opposition sort of gets to set is question period. Yeah. That's when you actually get some ice time on the local news, in the news, in the media, and can get up and attempt to set an agenda of what you think the government ought to be looking at. And in effect, what the government is saying right now is, we're going to deprive you of 4, 5, 6 weeks of potential ice time in question period when you could hold our feet to the fire. And you can understand why the opposition would be plenty upset about that.
Well, and as I guess I've already alluded to this, but we're coming up against the very strong likelihood of a spring election,
right?
And every week, every day, frankly, of the opposition being able to put themselves in front of the cameras, every one of those days counts, and losing one of those days is just to the benefit of the government.
Mm-hmm. Now let's obviously we're not going to go through all of the names of the new people who came in, but we might want to pluck a couple of them out of the backbenches here, because, for example, Natalia Kuzendova from one of the Mississauga ridings, she is now the new Minister of Long-Term Care. This is a woman who is a nurse. This is a woman who did emergency room shifts during COVID, even though she was an MPP. So there is, I would suggest, some real logic about putting her in that portfolio. We'll pluck another name out of the backbenches here. Nolan Quinn is a guy who is now a cabinet minister. He's from Eastern Ontario. Yep. What's the significance of him getting that gig?
Well, we have mentioned before when we were talking about the what did they call it? The Ottawa Regional Office that the Premier created. That was a job that should traditionally have been done by, frankly, an MPP, right? It's the job of MPPs in cabinet to represent their constituents when the government is making policy and say, well, actually, you know what? Out in Ottawa, that idea is a really bad one, and it's going to kill us with the voters. The Premier has Ottawa area MPPs that he could name to cabinet. He has chosen not to. Now, Nolan Quinn is the MPP for,
here we go, Stormont, Dundas, South Glengarry, I think, off the top of my head. Is that right?
Exactly right. Stormont, Dundas, South Glengarry, which is Eastern Ontario. I think it would be a stretch to call it an Ottawa area riding, but it's
in the neighborhood.
It's in the neighborhood. So now you've got Steve Clark, who is also Eastern Ontario, and Nolan Quinn. So you've got a bit more representation than there had been until this shuffle. You know what
else? Nolan's birthday was 4 days ago. How's this for a birthday? Well, happy 41st birthday, and that's a pretty good birthday present for you, Nolan. Excuse me, Minister. I'm not going to call him Nolan anymore. Minister.
But yeah, so I think that is one example of the significance of these changes.
Now, just as there were some backbenchers who got in, some of whom maybe didn't expect to get in, there were some backbenchers who did not get in, who were really hoping to get in, or who had reasonable expectations of getting in because they have been there, let's say, for example, since 2018. They've got some experience. They thought they brought something to the dance. I don't know how many of these names you want to go through, but, Robin Martin, for example, represents Eglinton Lawrence right near us, right near this studio here. I mean, she has done a lot of legwork in defense of this government, particularly in defending some of its less popular moves. And for whatever reason, here's another shuffle. She's a bright person and once again does not get in. I don't know how many other names you want to add to the list.
Well, I mean, on Martin, of course, we can also say that more recently, she did cause some trouble for the government on the issue of the keffiyeh ban. She was not the only one by any means, but she did break with the party on that and really drew a line and sort of dared the premier to cross the line.
We should just say, she refused to give unanimous consent to having the keffiyeh unbanned.
Yes.
She insisted that it continue to be banned in the chamber.
Yes. And then, as I say, not the only one to do so, though she was quite public about it. And Eglinton Lawrence is a riding that you might want to hold on to.
It's a bellwether seat. It's a swing riding. Goes with the government.
Then you've got Donna Skelly in Hamilton, or the Hamilton area, who again elected in 2018. Again has done a lot of the legwork defending this government. Has been. Can I say pugnacious at times when the government has asked its defenders to be pugnacious? She's done that.
Hamiltonians are pugnacious,
Well, I would never say that about you, of course. But Skelly's just another example of these cases of people who've done their time in the trenches, and for whatever reason, I mean, you can't put everybody in cabinet, though. Perhaps this government will try. But yeah, Skelly, another case of somebody who has been passed over again.
JMM, do we like our historical footnotes here?
There's nothing we love more.
There is nothing we love more than our historical footnotes, so let's share this one. Mike Harris Jr. He is the MPP for Kitchener-Conestoga. He is, as you might suspect from the name, the son of the 22nd Premier of Ontario. He is now in the cabinet. And I think he becomes just the second ever offspring of a premier to become a cabinet minister. We're going to go back to 1943. Harry Nixon was the Premier of Ontario in that year. His son, Robert Nixon, who's still going strong, incidentally, at age 95. I'm going to go visit him in a couple of weeks in Paris, Ontario. He became a cabinet minister in David Peterson's government in 1985. So he was the first, but Mike Harris Jr. now becomes the second. And of course, those of you who are thinking, wait a minute, what about Caroline Mulroney? Okay, she is the offspring of a prime minister, not a premier. So we put all this on the record for you fellow onpoli nerds. What do you think of that?
Well, I do want the audience to know that we do fact check each other at least a little bit on this podcast when we can. And I went back just to double check that PC MPP Norm Miller, who was an MPP in the previous legislature, is the son of former Premier Frank Miller. He never held a minister's portfolio between 2018 and 2022, which would have been his only opportunity to. We sometimes goof on this podcast.
We do?
We have on occasion. Yeah. We don't like to dwell on it. But it's not because we don't do quality control. We do check each other. And I put that out there to let people know that we do try to do the work.
Good quality control, brother. There we go. And with that, on to issue 2. For the first time in 4 decades, the Mississauga mayor's race is actually a bit of a nail-biter. That's because there's no Hazel McCallion or Bonnie Crombie on the ballot. They always won easily. This time, Mississaugans have a choice among several candidates, and with turnout for this by-election expected to be low, no one's really sure how accurate the polls are.
So the person who had been leading the polls for the first few weeks of the race is councillor and one-time MP Carolyn Parrish. Parrish has been a Mississauga politician for many years. Some folks may remember her outspoken views on the Iraq War and getting kicked out of the Federal Liberal Caucus about 20 years ago. She has consistently led in the polls, but more recently it seemed to tighten up a little bit. Parrish opted not to participate in some of the later debates through the election campaign. There's some speculation that might have hurt her in the polls, or it might simply be that undecided voters are making choices closer to Election Day. As you say, with low turnout, relatively small movements in the polls might end up being significant.
Her explanation for not participating in future mayoral debates was that she was getting too much harassment online and therefore felt threatened, she and her staff, and therefore made a decision to take a pass. But as you point out, we'll see whether or not that has an adverse impact. Okay, so Parrish, definitely not a lock to win this thing, so who else is on the ballot?
So there are actually 20 people on the ballot, and we are not going to profile every single one of the remaining 19. There are some higher profile names that are familiar to Queen's Park watchers, however, and I wanted to highlight some of them. Deepika Demerla is the former MPP for Mississauga East Cooksville. She lost her seat in the 2018 Liberal wipeout. The most recent poll I have been able to see as we record this had Demerla very close to tied with Parrish. It could still be a tight race.
There is another name that you should bring to people's attention because those who are true onpoli nerds will remember him from running for the 2020 Ontario Liberal leadership.
That's right. Behind Demerla, we've got Alvin Tejo, who, as you say, did run unsuccessfully for the Liberal leadership race 4 years ago. He then went on to win a Mississauga council seat in 2022. Folks may remember his leadership bid. He was a bit unconventional. He advocated for a universal basic income during that leadership bid. If I remember correctly, he brought like a universal basic income robot to the actual convention hall
for his speech on the day. That's right. He had a robot up there with him.
So, his mayoral campaign has emphasized the need for more housing in Mississauga so that younger people in particular can afford to live in the GTA's second largest city.
Well, you've also put your finger here on why this race is of importance to so many people. Mississauga is the third largest city in the province of Ontario, behind Toronto and Ottawa. So whoever ends up holding this Mississauga mayor's chair, they're going to be a player, right? They're going to be a significant player in not only the future of Mississauga politics, but in Ontario politics writ large as well.
And of course, the only reason that there is a race in the first place is because the former mayor left her position to take a job of some significance in provincial politics. Our listeners might have heard of Bonnie Crombie once or twice in the last few months.
I believe the name has come up once or twice in the past few months. Yes, that's true. What else?
Well, there is one other thing, and this is sort of like the dog that didn't bark in the nighttime, if I can put it that way. People may remember that Toronto had its own special mayoral election last year, and Premier Doug Ford went out of his way to endorse a specific candidate in that race, in no uncertain terms, warned against electing the candidate who did, in fact, end up winning.
Do you remember the quote? Remember what he said?
It was an utter disaster.
Unmitigated.
Unmitigated disaster.
It would be an unmitigated disaster, Premier Ford said, if Olivia Chow won. And then she did, and the next day he said, she's actually a very nice person, and I'm sure we'll get along just fine.
Politics.
Exactly.
But, people remember that Ford's preferred candidate, former Toronto Police Chief Mark Saunders, came in a pretty distant third. So I think it is notable in this context that now Ford is a Toronto MPP on top of being the leader of the PC party and Premier of Ontario. So there's at least some argument that that's why he weighed in on that mayoral race. But he's been mum on this mayoral contest.
Because
it didn't go well for him last time, perhaps.
Yeah. And what party do the three leading contenders represent?
Well, yes. The three candidates who we've mentioned here are all associated with the Liberal Party.
They are indeed. As was the previous mayor, I believe.
Yes, indeed.
I think that's true. And with that, it's on to issue 3. The province continues to try to decentralize healthcare, hoping to take some services out of expensive hospital settings and moving those services into privately owned and operated community options where you'll still be able to use your OHIP card, not your credit card, to pay. The government is putting out the call for proposals for new MRI clinics. And before you describe what's going on, I always like to do this in the interest of full disclosure thing. My wife is a health policy consultant. She works on issues like this. So we put that out there in the interest of full disclosure. Anyway, take it away.
So on Monday, the government announced a call for applications to license new community surgical and diagnostic centres across Ontario, with the stated goal of adding 100,000 more MRI and CT scans for patients each year, shrinking wait times to 28 days or less in each region of the province. Later this summer, the government will also open calls for GI endoscopy procedures and orthopedic surgeries. These will, as you mentioned earlier, these will continue continue to be publicly funded procedures through OHIP. But ever since the government announced this plan more than a year ago, it has, of course, had its critics.
Yeah, for sure. And there is, I think at the top of the list, we'd put the group called the Ontario Health Coalition, which represents unionized healthcare workers in the sector, and they are opposed to a further decentralization of services. Now, their critics would say, because the new jobs in these independent health facilities tend to be non-union jobs, which the Health Coalition doesn't like. Obviously, they want future jobs and current jobs to be unionized. Proponents of these new clinics say that Canada is the only country in the world that is still fixated on this debate of whether we're going to have private versus public ownership of independent health facilities. We apparently, I've seen a study which says we have the second worst access to healthcare services in the entire OECD. We are only ahead of the United States, where, of course, if you're rich, you can get access whenever you like, but everybody else has a hard time. So the philosophy, I guess, behind the government's move here is to get increased access in the community away from hospital-based settings, which are often not only more expensive, but might be more dangerous too, in some ways.
I think that's an important point to make. Something we learned during the COVID pandemic is, hospitals really can be a risky place for procedures if there is some better option, or sometimes any other option. We learned how prevalent hospital-related infections can be, and I remember long before this government was elected, the then Liberal Minister of Health saying that pushing procedures out of the hospital setting was something that they wanted to do. One of the most prominent examples that we've seen so far, however, is still in a hospital setting. This is in Ottawa, where private doctors have effectively rented an OR from the Ottawa Riverside Hospital, and they have performed hundreds of procedures there now. And in fact, they've stated their intention to expand those offerings. But you can see that, the flip side of this is also the criticism of the government, that there are resources in our healthcare system that are sitting idle and unused. If that OR weren't available to be rented, it could be used by the publicly funded system, and that would be, I think, we could say fairly, that's the kind of thing that the Health Coalition would prefer to see the existing public system more comprehensively used.
Yeah, on the other hand, there is an argument to be made that hospitals are good settings for the most complicated cases, which are really difficult, which you wouldn't want to do in a private clinic out in the community. But for easy stuff, cataracts, hips and knees, maybe even, hernia operations. Shouldice has been doing this for decades and decades and decades. These are places where the argument goes, you could remove some of those services from the hospitals who, in some respects, have perverse incentives to want to keep those services because, of course, they get paid by the government to do those services, and they need that money to keep the lights on. So there's a lot of perverse incentives in the hospital system, and this issue certainly shines a light on that.
No, absolutely, and we should say that among the other advocates for more community clinics and community centers for care includes people like the Ontario Medical Association, who they might benefit in some ways from that, but they're also, I think you could fairly say, they have some sense of what the healthcare sector needs.
Some sense, yes. And with that, we're going to check in on the stuff that JMM and I wrote this past week. Time now for our regular feature. It's called Your Column, My Column, in which John Michael and I reminisce about the pieces we wrote for TVO.org this past week. What do you got teed up for us?
So I actually wrote this a bit further ago than last week, but it is relevant to the week's events. The Grassy Narrows First Nation has announced that it is suing the governments of Ontario and Canada over the harms of mercury pollution in the Wabigoon River. I assume our listeners know much of this just from prior coverage, but just in case, decades ago, a pulp mill in Dryden, Ontario, dumped several tons of mercury waste into the Wabigoon. That pollution eventually made it as far as the waters of Manitoba, but the most acute effects were felt in the waters around Grassy Narrows, where mercury poisoned the fish and people who eat the fish. The majority of members of the Grassy Narrows First Nation show some of the symptoms of mercury poisoning now today. That pollution stopped decades ago, but new science suggests that the mill, which is still there and still operating, doing is indirectly exacerbating the problem all the same. So I wrote about all of this last month before the First Nation announced its lawsuit, and I'm just going to declare a bias here and say that I've written for a few times now for TVO about how shameful this whole story is, how it implicates all of us, including those of us who were not even born before this all happened. It wraps up so many issues, our relationship between Northern Ontario and Southern Ontario, but of course, most importantly and acutely, the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people.
I don't think it's a bias to say you don't think it's a good idea for people to be poisoned by eating the fish out of a river that they depend on.
Well, I mean, this column that I'm talking about in particular, I think I start off by saying we're going to find out whether it's possible for a province to be sued out of existence. And I didn't even know that this lawsuit was coming, but it is such a really absurd legal situation and, as you say, a shameful moral one as well.
Right.
How about you?
This week, I wrote about something called the Premier's Gravesites Program, which came into effect, when was that? 2007. Premier Dalton McGuinty was the premier who brought this program in. And I guess this program started, what is this now, 17 years ago or so? 17 years ago. Because there was, if you go to cemeteries all over the province of Ontario, there was nothing in place to indicate here rests a former Premier of Ontario. And this is, after all, a pretty exclusive club. You know, since 1867, there have been 26 Premiers of Ontario. It's a pretty rarefied air up on the top of that mountain. So the McGuinty government decided to task the Ontario Heritage Trust with coming up with a way of designating, you know, here lies a former Premier of Ontario. And what they have subsequently done in the intervening years is they put really quite a beautiful bronze plaque with the Premier's name and date served and an Ontario flag by the final resting places. So if you are, as we are occasionally, we're 20 minutes away from Mount Pleasant Cemetery, for example, and you can wander through Mount Pleasant Cemetery and you can come upon, I think Premier Hearst is there, Premier Ferguson's there, Premier Henry's there, Premier Mowat is there, and you see the flags and you see the plaques and, you know, you learn a little something about our history just by the by. And the program's dirt cheap.
You're going to have to take me on a walking tour someday.
I will do that. I will happily do that. Well, guess whose turn it was this week? Here's the hint. Brampton. Okay, I think I gave it away there.
Would it happen to be a Mr. William Davis?
I believe you are correct. Yes, William Grenville Davis. The 18th Premier of the province of Ontario. There was a beautiful ceremony at PAMA, the Peel Art Gallery, Museum and Archives. And PAMA is located in the former Brampton Courthouse, and this was really a very special location for the Davis family because Bill Davis's father, who went by the initial A. Grenville Davis, he was a Crown attorney in Peel, Brampton, for 30 plus years. So the ceremony was held in the former courtroom where Bill Davis's dad would have worked for all those years. So it was kind of cool. And there were two former premiers there, Mike Harris and Ernie Eves, both of whom got elected in 1981 as quote-unquote Bill Davis conservatives. The mayor of Brampton, Patrick Brown, was there. Mr. Davis's wife of 55 years, Kathleen Davis, who's in her 90s now, she was there. The kids who call themselves the Originals, they were there. The five children of Bill Davis, Neil, Nancy, Catherine, Ian, and Meg, they were all there. And the next generation was there, a fourth great-grandchild. Guess what the kid's name is?
Well, I have no idea.
Yes, you do. Take a guess.
Is it Bill?
It is. Of course it is, yes. Jeffries is the last name. This is Kate Davis, one of Bill Davis's grandchildren's, their first child, Kate Davis's first child. And the kid was 2 weeks old and came to the thing, and the child's name is William Jeffries. It's a beautiful thing. And if you go to the Brampton Cemetery, you will now see a bronze plaque and an Ontario flag, thanks to the Ontario Heritage Trust, which operates the Premier's Gravesites program. So, there we go. And with that, shall we go to the mailbag?
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, send it along to onpolitics@tvo.org.
This email from David Fielder. And there's two parts of the question, and strangely enough, I'm actually going to start with the second part of David's email. He writes, with the recent Ontario Court of Appeals ruling allowing Toronto Transit Commission workers to strike, should the government want to have that legislation remain in effect, I believe they could repass it, invoking the notwithstanding clause. If they did so, could the revised legislation also set pay terms as well, rather than having contract negotiations go to binding arbitration? Okay, David wrote this email when it was still a possibility that the TTC might go on strike. We now know that will not happen. They came to a tentative agreement. Bravo. Hosannas all around. But it is a good opportunity to talk about how this government can and has used the notwithstanding clause of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in these cases. So, JMM, bring us up to speed with that.
Right. So people might remember that early in the last decade, at the urging of the late Mayor Rob Ford, the province classified TTC workers as an essential service that did not have the right to strike. A few years ago, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that strikes are a charter-protected labor right, and the union representing TTC workers went to court to see if they could reverse the law that was passed in 2011. Ontario's highest court, just a few weeks ago, ruled that the law removing the strike rights of TTC workers did not pass charter muster, effectively saying that while there was a real public problem that the law was trying to solve, it was constitutional overkill.
Well, let's do a what if here. If the TTC had gone on strike, could the province have invoked the notwithstanding clause to overturn those rights?
They certainly could have. We've mentioned before that you can't use the notwithstanding clause on every section of the Charter. There are some areas that are protected, but the sections that do involve labor rights are fair game. Courts have ruled against governments trying to dictate specific pay outcomes, including they've ruled against the Ford government on those grounds. But if you're going to invoke the notwithstanding clause, a lot of those decisions just fall by the wayside.
Well, let's do a little walk down memory lane as well here, because we have seen this Ford government use the notwithstanding clause, or we've seen them use the notwithstanding clause, and then we have seen them attempt to use the notwithstanding clause as it relates to labor rights. And how did that go exactly?
It blew up in their faces. We are referring here to the incident with education workers back in the fall of 2022. They introduced legislation with the notwithstanding clause, and there was a huge outcry from the labor movement, including private sector labor unions that the government very much wants to keep on their side. So they eventually, of course, retreated. Now, they might gamble in this hypothetical scenario, if the TTC had struck, they might have gambled that the public would view a TTC strike differently than an education strike. Mm-hmm. I kind of think that's unlikely. And in fact, we know that the Premier's office had said they were not going to be the first to try to legislate workers back to work. They were going to wait for the mayor to make the first move. They wanted a request from Mayor Olivia Chow if they were going to talk about any kind of legislation.
Which would have given them some political cover.
Yes, exactly. So, I'll also, just on that point of back-to-work legislation, say that the Court of Appeal decision did seem to leave the door open to back-to-work legislation. It simply said that you couldn't preemptively take away the right to strike. This may be an issue that future governments have to confront, and there the issue will be, can you convince a court that the public harms of the strike are sufficient, that back-to-work legislation is reasonable.
Gotcha. Now, let's jump back to the first part of David's email, which reads as follows. Back in the day, Steve declared a rule for the pod that every episode would have a reference to Bill Davis, and every episode would have a reference to Hamilton, Ontario, my hometown. Unfortunately, since the move to video format, I don't think that rule has always been upheld. Can we expect to see a return in the future, or have we moved away from that commitment in the new medium? Well, David, you'll be happy to know we already had the reference in your column, my column, to the Bill Davis Premier's gravesite unveiling this past week. So why don't we just continue along that merry path, and we'll show a couple of pictures. Sheldon, if you would, bring these pictures up. Here's Kathleen Davis, Mr. Davis's wife of 55 years or so, along with two former premiers of Ontario, both of whom, incidentally, got elected in 1981 for the first time as quote-unquote Bill Davis conservatives. There's Mike Harris, the 22nd premier on the left, Ernie Eves, the 23rd premier on the right. And how about one more photo? These folks call themselves the Originals, and these are Mr. Davis's kids. Okay, to the left of the plaque, that's Ian Davis, who's the youngest son, Kathleen Davis again, the mother, Meg Davis standing beside the plaque, and then to the right of the plaque, Nancy Bennett, who is the oldest daughter, Catherine Davis, who is the next in the line of order. And then on the right of the shot is Neil Davis, who is the oldest kid. And boy, there are some days when he is the absolute spit image of his father. And in fact, works as a lawyer at the Davis law firm in Brampton to this day, where both his father, the premier, worked, and his grandfather, the former Crown attorney from Peel County, also worked. So that's 3 generations practicing law in what they used to call Peel County, now Brampton, Ontario, Canada. And I have now, David, fulfilled my constitutional obligation to you. And one last thing, if you want to see these pictures, if you're listening on podcast, and you obviously can't, but I have described them, we will have a link to my column in the show notes. There are tons of pictures there from the day. It was really a glorious day. And if you're kind of an onpoli nerd like us, you may want to see these pictures.
Again, if you'd like to ask about content on the show or have any comments, please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, June 7th, 2024. Special thanks to our studio crew for making this podcast look so darn good. And let's give a special shout out this week, shall we? Chad Castle's over there on camera 3. Chad, thanks for keeping me in focus. And to the rest of the gang, your moment will come in the weeks ahead. And with that, bye-bye.
See you next week.
We want to start with some very difficult statistics to start our conversation. Sheldon, let's put this up here. In 2022, there were 117,093 victims, 12 years of age and older, of police-reported intimate partner violence. Of those victims, nearly 80% were women and girls. The rate of intimate partner violence was more than 3 times higher among women and girls than men and boys. And the rate is 7 times higher among women and girls if you look at the age 12 to 24 years than their male counterparts in the same demographic. Okay, Paula, let's just make sure we're all talking about the same thing here. An explanation of what intimate partner violence is.
It's when you are in an intimate relationship and there is violence and abuse there. So it could be physical, sexual, psychological, emotional, financial as well. Partners are in a relationship where one has power and control over the other one. And like you mentioned in the stats, it's pervasive in our society. When we're talking about minority groups or women, Indigenous women, those stats go even higher.
Well, let me follow up on that with Stephanie. I mean, it may be obvious to say it, but let's do it anyway. This is disproportionately something that affects women. How come?
I think it's because of patriarchal society, really, and really that's still alive today and the history as well. And so men, you know, the old adage of being the primary breadwinner as well, women are home taking care of the children, and it makes it a lot easier in those instances for women to be perpetrated by men, right, for abuse.
Derek, there was something in the stats I just gave that kind of caught my eye, and that was the expression police reported, which I infer from that there is a lot of this that goes on that is not police reported. Is that true?
That's absolutely true. And speaking with our partner agencies and that, the reports we get are way low compared to what's reported to our partner agencies.
So what we're seeing here potentially is the tip of the iceberg.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to put another graphic up here, and for those listening on podcast, I'm going to describe what we're seeing here. This is essentially a graph that starts in the year 2009, goes to about 2022. 2 things that we want to bring to people's attention here. Number 1, the comparison of women and girls overall and men and boys. The lines for women and girls, as we have suggested, much higher than for men and boys. But we can also see that from 2009, the rates start to drop. And around 2014, they sort of go into a valley, but then they slowly climb back up again as we get to the year 2022. I think we need some explanation for that. Does anybody here have an explanation for why the numbers dropped when they did, but now they're going back up again.
I think a piece of the reason why we see it climb is that's right at the time of the pandemic. And so that was a high-risk time, or a time where we really saw an increase in intimate partner violence because of all the stay-at-home orders. And the stay-at-home orders put people that were already victimized even more at risk because they were socially isolated even further. And also, as we all know, it put a lot of stress and strain on our own families, let alone where there's already violence and anger within a home environment.
Angela, how do you encounter this issue as a city councillor?
So through the city, we have taken on the declaration. Sault Ste. Marie has declared intimate partner violence an epidemic. We have encouraged the province to do so. As a councillor and as a woman myself, I have taken it upon myself also to work with Angie's Angels, a locally formed group that is speaking on behalf of Angie Sweeney after her death. And we have put forward a motion to support Bill C-332 to amend the criminal code to include coercive control. So we are trying our best in the small ways that we can affect municipally. We're using our voices to the provincial and federal governments to try and put an end to this epidemic.
We want to start with a chart, and you can all watch it on the monitors up top or on the wall over there, showing what, in fact, the government takes in revenue from booze sales compared to what it costs to treat the harms that are caused by alcohol sales. Now, these are 2020 numbers. Sheldon, bring this graphic up if you would. It's detailed, so for those listening on podcast who can't see the numbers, I'm going to go through this a bit. If you take the country as a whole, the country as a whole takes in $13 billion plus from alcohol revenue, but StatsCan says the total societal cost of this is approaching $20 billion. In other words, a net deficit of $6.3 billion. Let's go province by province. In Quebec, $2.8 billion in revenue, $3.2 billion in the cost of alcohol sales, therefore a $430 million deficit. In Ontario, more than $5 billion in government revenue by selling booze, but $7 billion plus in the costs of dealing with the after effects. That's $2 billion in the whole. And Saskatchewan, $300 million plus in the whole. Alberta, $1.8 billion plus in the whole. British Columbia, nearly $1 billion in the whole, dealing with all of these things. Okay, Ononda, let's start with you. Could you explain how, just give us some more detail on whether it makes sense to be as indebted to booze sales given the costs associated with it? What's your view?
Sure. I think that, this is a great way to start the conversation. I think what we're trying to do is trying to come up with a welfare function for society. The government has to raise revenue. But when we look at costs, it's just not the cost of running the operation, but it's also the social costs. In economics, we call it negative externalities to health and so on and so forth. I think the way to think about it is that it's a layered approach. Like the first point is that how do we make alcohol available in society, right?
And they've made an announcement about that in the last couple of weeks. They're liberalizing sales.
They're liberalizing sales, and this is a continuation of policies which began in 2015.
Yes.
Right? And so you want to ask yourself that, are we doing that efficiently, right? That's the first point. Because we want to get to a point that when you look at net revenue, that sort of balances the harm. There's always going to be harm with alcohol consumption. And what I've studied in my research is the differences across provinces. So when you look at Alberta, on a per capita basis, they make much more in alcohol sales than Ontario and other provinces. And the reason is that because they don't have administrative expenses. It's about $30 million, $67 million or something. And the reason is that because they don't manage their outlets, unlike what we have in Ontario. In Ontario,
it's a privatized system out there.
It's a privatized system. In Ontario, we have the government running the LCBO and the outlets, and that's about $1.9 or $2 billion.
Yep.
So we're ending up with a net income of $2.5 billion. So that's more than the net income we have in Alberta. But on a per capita basis, Alberta is much more. So now the point being, what I'm trying to get at is that this perception among the population that if you have deregulation, it actually results in lower net income. that's not true. That's not necessarily true.
All right, let me go to Norman with a follow-up here, and that is, can you give us a little bit more detail? When those numbers say that it actually costs society more to sell booze than the taxation revenue realized by selling booze, what does that refer to?
That refers to, excuse me, a number of things. It refers to a whole range of health costs, both emergency room and inpatient treatment, doctor's costs and staff costs. It also refers to law enforcement costs, justice system costs, policing costs. It refers to workplace disruptions and costs related to that. There's about a list of 20 or 30 categories that the team has examined with regard to the provinces and the territories.
That many categories?
Yeah, a lot of categories. And the other thing I would like to mention is that there's been recent research published this year indicating that the gap between the revenue and the costs is getting bigger.
This moment in history seems to be an unprecedented moment in women's professional sports. Why is it happening now?
I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of those reasons are sitting amongst us. It's the work and the foundation that women have put in over the years. It's not to say that women's sports are new in Canada, but the professional level at which they're coming has been off the backs of so much toil and starts and stops again. But I think there's a variety of things. The level of competition is elite, the globalization of women's sports, definitely the investment and the attention. And some people with deep pockets are finally paying attention. So, and that actually is a factor and it matters. I'm not the business expert, but what I do know is the way that media has also been paying attention. So there's so many pieces that kind of feel like the engine is finally moving. All the cogs are moving together.
Helen, let me get you to build on that, in as much as, Shireen is right, we've always had superstar female athletes around. Nancy Green is a skier in Canada. Billie Jean King was a huge superstar. Liz Manley captured the hearts of the country when she was figure skating. Penny Oleksiak, Perdita Felician. That's always been there. What's different now?
I think we also have the women in leadership now who go like us, like our group, put in the investment of time and money, and the whole community is ready for it. The amount of support that we get building the professional women's hockey league and our club in Toronto is incredible. People just can't wait for us to get started, and just the level of support and excitement and we get by women, but by everybody. It's the whole country is ready for this.
I think that's the point. It's not just women. Men support women's sports as well now. That's different.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, Coach, I got to ask you, how much of the rise in excitement around the WNBA coming to Toronto is because of a young woman named Caitlin Clark?
Well, it's a lot. For sure, it's a lot. I mean, Caitlin's very, very impressive, as we all know. But as Shireen mentioned, there are a lot of impressive women that have been playing for a long time now. And, it's kind of, I was saying to Shireen earlier, it's like this bucket of water has been filled. It's the WNBA, and there's all these players that have played. And that final drop of Caitlin Clark has kind of tipped the bucket and pushed it over the edge. And now people are jumping on board. So it's wonderful to see. It's long overdue. And I think most people's opinion, and hopefully it just continues to grow.
She's had a tough start in her professional basketball career. Now, you're a coach. Do you want to give her any advice on how she can do better?
I think Caitlin's doing just fine, to be honest. I mean, it's an eye-opener when you get to that level. You're not the best. You're playing with the best now. So it's going to be a learning curve for her, but she's a smart player, and I'm sure she has lots of people around her that'll help her with that learning curve.
Ella, can I start with a trivia question for you?
Absolutely.
Okay, here we go. Professional Women's Hockey League, who scored the first ever goal in PWHL history?
I'm going to have to go with Ella Shelton.
I think that's right. I think that was you. How much does that mean to you?
Yeah, it's absolutely incredible to think back to that moment and the memory I get to share with not only my teammates and my coaches, but teammates that I play against all the time now that we're not on the national team together, and my family and my support people behind me. Going back to that day, I just think like Toronto is such a place where it's close to home, and so many people came to support me. And I'm sure Toronto would have loved to have scored that first goal, but I know that the whole crowd and the entire fan base of the PWHL was supporting me, and super happy to see me come up on top with that goal. And it's something that I'll remember forever. And it was quite emotional going back and seeing it in the Hall of Fame and being able to be a part of history and know that I'm making an impact today, and hopefully it's enough and I do enough for the future generations.
I'm pretty sure you didn't cover World War II firsthand. So the first question is kind of obvious. How did you find this story?
Yeah, I have to give all credit to our producer at the time in London, Stephanie Genzer, who, we were there in London as a correspondent there. Every year we did a story about D-Day. We would mark the anniversary, we'd go to Normandy, and that particular year was the 75th anniversary, so it was a big anniversary 5 years ago. She came with Sonia's story and said, would you like to do this story? And I said, well, I'd been here for 7 years or so, and I had never done a woman's story for D-Day. It was always men, and it was always men often who landed on the beaches, and the many heroes who walked in on D-Day and did the hard work that liberated France. And so that's how the story came to me initially. But then I was taken with the story of Sonia. So she is, she's both a combatant and a civilian, and she's a fighter, but she's also a victim in the story. And so after we did the piece, we had such a reaction from people, women, people from all walks of society, but especially women wrote and said, how is it that we don't know about Sonia d'Artois? And I remember many times lying there at night thinking about what she did and how I wanted to know more. And then I realized also that there was a bigger story to Sonia. Her husband is also a story, an amazing story all on his own. So the two together, I just couldn't get them out of my mind. And so I called up the family again and I said, has anyone thought about writing a book about this? And she said, many times, but no one has. And here we are 5 years later, and that's how it happened.
Next week on the agenda.
I covered democracy movements all over the world, from Poland in the early 1980s, South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia. And what I've learned is, in the short run, when you have people of principle going against people with machine guns, the machine guns are likely to prevail.
That's next week on the agenda.